Hi everybody, my name is Emily and welcome back to my channel where I review, critique, and summarize scary children's books. Today I will be your guide to The Dark Missions of Edgar Brim, the first in a YA horror series by Shane Peacock. In this video, I will summarize the book for you. I'm going to talk a little bit about the story content and give that a bit of a review, and finally, as always, I'm going to talk about any horror elements at play here. So first, I want to give a huge shout out to my good friend Caitlin over at her blog, Lit Bookology, for giving me the opportunity to read and review this book. Guys, if you like children's literature and YA, definitely go check out her blog. She's doing some YouTube stuff as well, and she does book reviews with a focus on audiobooks and adaptation, especially YA. And she's just starting out, so go over there and give Caitlin some love if you haven't heard of her already. She's super knowledgeable, and I can't wait to see what she does with her blog in the future, and she actually might review this book as well. Thanks, Caitlin! Alright guys, so The Dark Missions of Edgar Brim is a YA horror gothic fantasy novel set in the 19th century, starring a fearful young man named Edgar Brim who is haunted by nightmares. Following the mysterious death of his father, Edgar is sent to a boarding school on the Scottish moors where his nightmares and fears just seem to get worse until a horrific chain of events leads him to an unusual society run by one of his professors that believes that monsters in literature are all real. What follows is a gothic adventure with various plot twists and points of intrigue. So guys, I'm actually really sad to say that this book really didn't work for me, but there are a few things that I liked about it, so I'll start with those. I love gothic horror, and I especially love intertextual horror, and this book is extremely intertextual, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the idea of the story itself is a good one, and Shane sprinkles the story with various references and gothic elements, and the idea that all these monsters and creatures from the horror literature of the time, the idea that they could be real, is actually a really fun one. And not only are they real, but there's also this idea that the society wants to go out and destroy them. So you do get this sort of demon hunting bent to the story, which is pretty cool. So the concept for this book is good, but unfortunately that's where the positives for this book actually end for me. Pretty much everything else in this book gave me pause. So let's talk about it. The first thing that I really have a hang-up on here is the structure. So the story begins with kind of a flash forward to an event near the climax of the story in order to cause intrigue and get the reader hooked into the story. And this isn't like a bad thing to do, but then right after that we're taking back in time in the next chapter to when Edgar was a baby, and then the following chapter takes place a few years later, and then the following chapter takes place 5 years later. It gives you a little bit of whiplash, and you're just trying to follow this as best you can as a reader, but it's not easy when you're just jumping into a book. And there isn't something inherently wrong with jumping around in time like this in a story, but it does have a few big consequences for the book. The first one being that we don't get to know Edgar Brim pretty much at all over the course of these crucial first chapters of the story. We get to know a little bit about what happens to him and about how he experiences these nightmares. We're kind of just told who he is through these snapshots of his childhood and his early teen years. And the consequence is a really flat and lifeless main character. Another consequence of jumping around in time like this right at the beginning of the story is that it honestly feels like the book starts off with some drudgery for the reader. It feels like you have to do a lot of work to get into the meat of the story, which is not the greatest way to start off a book, you know? I don't mind doing some work as a reader when it comes to things later in a book, when I feel like the author and the story have earned my focus and earned my attention. But you can't really get that when you start out a book with some really heavy lifting for the reader, right? And I'm going to talk a little bit about this concept of earning something in a book a little bit later as well, but it really is a big problem here. The jumping around in time does eventually stop, and you're really able to get kind of into the chronological narrative of the story. But the problems with the structure still persist. For a gothic horror novel of this nature, it's actually kind of amazing how much conversation there is in this novel about fighting monsters and about creatures and monsters, rather than actual scenes where we see monsters and see creatures and stuff like that. In fact, there's a number of times in the book, multiple times, where Edgar and his team see something or experience something that they think is a monster, or they think a monster is going to come get them, or they've laid a trap for a monster, and then it turns out just to be one of his weird professors. And every time this happens, you just know that they're going to have a long conversation about something that doesn't really seem to pertain to the plot at all. As a reader, you're just like, ugh. There is definitely some more monster action towards the end of the story, so that's something, but even then it just seems pretty dull. There's actually remarkably little suspense and excitement for a book with this concept, and I honestly think it's because the writing and the structure really leave a lot to be desired. Which brings me to the second thing that I had a really big hang-up on this book, and that is the writing. This book really feels almost like a first draft. There are tons of grammatical and syntactical errors. If syntactical is a word, it would be ironic if I said that word and it wasn't a word right there. There's something specific that Peacock does where he changes the tense that the story is written in depending on when the scene is in the story. So he'll use past tense for events happening in the past and present tense for things happening in the present, which makes sense. And when he does it, it's not too distracting at all, but then sometimes the tense changes mysteriously in the middle of a scene for absolutely no reason, and you just have to think that that's an error, that there really is no purpose for that to change then. There are also all these unnecessary changes in points of view, especially in action scenes or scenes leading up to action scenes, and it's actually really perplexing. There's one scene where a character is kind of wriggling through a tiny hole in the wall, and Edgar, our main character, is in the room with all of their team behind her doing this. And Edgar is describing the scene through his point of view, and then all of a sudden he describes the expression on this girl who's wiggling through the wall's face. He says that her expression changes or something comes over her face, I can't really remember. But logistically, Edgar shouldn't be able to see what is on her face because he's in the room behind her. And it takes you a second to realize that you're actually not seeing from Edgar's point of view anymore, you're seeing from this girl who's going through the wall, her point of view. But it changes so randomly, there's really no break in the storytelling, and it's just really confusing for the reader. Again, you feel like you have to do work to understand what's actually going on. As far as horror elements go, I talked earlier in the video about how this book is extremely intertextual. It puts itself in conversation with other horror authors and other horror texts. And Peacock does this a number of ways. So we actually have the books that are existing inside the world of the story, things like Dracula and Frankenstein that are mentioned and are worked with in various ways. There's also the idea that a lot of these characters are actually named after big horror figures. So for example, one of Edgar's professor's names is Lovecraft. Edgar's name is Edgar. His dad's name is Allan. Edgar Allan Poe. Peacock also brings various horror figures and real figures from the Victorian era in. So we have Bram Stoker, who plays kind of a major character, and we have the actor Henry Irving as well. And then finally, he uses a lot of recognizable Gothic elements and atmosphere in his story. So there's definitely a love of horror here. You get the sense that Peacock is really passionate about all of these great horror writers, all these great horror texts. That being said though, horror in the actual text is used very unusually. As I was talking about before, even when there are horror things that happen in the text, there's very little suspense. It can come across as just really dull. Even when there are monsters and creatures attacking and plotting and things like that, it just does not come across as exciting at all. But with that in mind, there are also these moments in the text that are almost startlingly and disproportionately horrific. I'm thinking of one moment in particular, which I won't spoil for you guys, but when it comes up in the story, it just seems really outrageous, almost ridiculous. And I think the problem with this is that the story hasn't earned this moment. There isn't enough atmosphere, there isn't enough strong writing, there isn't enough character development throughout the story before this moment that could lead up to this in a way that would make it effective, if that makes any sense. It just feels like the story hasn't done the work to earn this horrific moment of violence that happens. It just feels out of place, and I don't know about you guys, but I think horror is something that really, really relies on good craft to back it up. Or else some of these moments, they'll just never land, right? They'll always feel ridiculous or outrageous, but for them to be really scary and disturbing in a good way, it really needs to have that good craft behind it. And unfortunately, it's something that this book lacks. So guys, I'm sorry to say that this book just wasn't for me. I didn't feel like it was a waste of time to read or anything. I hardly ever feel that way. I'm still glad that I read it. And I did really like the concept when it comes down to it, but it was just these technical details that really held the book back for me. I feel like with a really good and close edit and some TLC, there could really be something here, but as it is, unfortunately, I will not be continuing the series. Alright guys, so that is it for my review today. Thank you as always for watching. Caitlin, if you're watching this, I'm interested to know what you thought of this book. I'm a really, really critical reader, and I know you are too, but we might have a different opinion on this, so I'm really interested to see what you have to say. And guys, if you liked the video, go ahead and give it a like and leave me a comment down below and let me know what some of your favorite YA horror is. Like I've said before on this channel, I actually don't read a ton of YA, but I would love to delve into some YA horror that you guys recommend. And guys, if you want to see more of me on here, go ahead and click subscribe. I'll be here doing scary kids book reviews for the foreseeable future. And you can follow me on various social media. The links are in the description below. Alright guys, thank you again so much for watching, and I'll see you again next week. Bye!